I titled this "Show Me the Forest," which is frankly, a phrase I'm using more often because, well, first of all, I'm going to assume you all know a little bit about FSC, and I'm not really going to spend any time on that. We can get to it in the Q&A if you want to. But, these days it seems like there's a mass timber building, in the news almost every day. And as a guy who sees a lot of this news, I see a lot of these stories, and it always, maybe there's a passing mention of, oh, the wood came from sustainable forest management, or maybe there's no mention at all of the wood. And honestly, I think at the end of the day, mass timber is just a widget. It's another way that we can use wood to, improve the human condition and ideally steward the planet. But if we divorce it from the forest, then, why bother? What happens in the forest largely determines whether mass timber or any other forest product is a net positive for society or is just another way to degrade natural ecosystems. So show me the forest is my, pithy way, let's see, to do this. And to say it in a more, sort of, I guess, visual way, this is research by Arup that's in a book called The New Carbon Architecture, which is now a few years old, but still pretty new. A great book to have as a reference. The bottom line is, forests are a cause of climate change, and they're a solution to climate change. Deforestation and forest degradation produce a lot of emissions nationally and globally, and improved forest management, forest restoration, reforestation are big solutions people are using. At the scale of a construction project, which is what this analysis is doing, if you see the little dotted line that's nearly at the top of there, the worst case timber sourcing is almost as bad as a traditional concrete design building when it comes to carbon emissions over the life cycle of the project. The best case timber design and sourcing is very carbon sequestering, and between there is every possible outcome you might want to achieve. Of course, transportation matters. So if you're sourcing from halfway around the world, that's going to have a bigger transportation footprint than if you're sourcing regionally. But the forest management really matters, which is, the point I'm trying to make. And then, as a guy who likes to show pictures, this is a 1-minute video. I promise not to. Hear this? That was subtle, I know, but I like to, and to be clear, both of those forests are certified as sustainable, or one is certified as responsible, the other is sustainable. So, there's a big range in forestry, and those were literally 2 watersheds where we hired a drone operator to, fly over both of them. They were immediately adjacent, and, both being marketed as sustainable timber in the Oregon marketplace. So, as architects, engineers, contractors, owners, developers, how do you know? And of course, yes, by FSC, right, we got it. But, we're trying to get to another level. So what we're trying to understand as FSC is, is there an embodied carbon benefit or even a landscape level carbon benefit associated with FSC certified forest management? So in terms of where things are headed, we have 5 studies underway right now. David serves on an advisory body that we've pulled together with a group of folks. to weigh in on this, but we have 2 LCA studies under development following all the ISO standards, 14004. I'm not an expert on the ISO standards. We hired an LCA team to help us develop these. But what is novel about these 2 studies is that we are taking an inventory accounting based approach to look back over 20 years of forest management, 19 of which were under FSC certification, and quantify the forest carbon dynamics. And our assumption, our hope, I guess, is that this will be better than carbon neutral. We don't know that yet because we're still in the data collection phase, but we will then take those forest carbon dynamics and bring them into the environmental product declaration, replacing what is a carbon neutrality assumption now with actual forest carbon dynamics to influence the global warming potential indicator in that EPD. The rest of the EPD will be pretty standard as other industry EPDs are, relying on energy mixes and eutrophication, all the rest of it. But the global warming potential will bring in the forest carbon dynamics. And we've got a manufacturer that we're doing this with glue-lams and cross-laminated timber, which we see as kind of, the leading edge when people are thinking about embodied carbon in wood. We're also doing 3 regional studies. You can see where. These are forward-looking based on a model and a counterfactual. The counterfactual is that, there's baseline practices of forestry in these places. And then the question is, does what FSC requires predict there would be additional carbon storage in these regions? So these are more akin to, say, a forest carbon project developer. Is there something to sell here? Or a company sourcing from these regions that wants to say, because we use FSC, we stored this much more carbon in the forest. It's not really a product specific claim. It's a more of a landscape level forward-looking claim. So we're trying to test a couple different approaches in a variety of settings to really drive this forward. And the research team reports to me at some level, but I'm trying to move them as quickly as I can. But my latest estimation is sometime in the first half of 2023, this will be done. I'm pushing for early 2023, but we'll see. So what have we learned so far? Why isn't this? Okay, there we go. There's not that many vertically integrated companies left. There's some in Canada, but generally, supply chain transparency is pretty limited. So, I think Jake's going to get into some of the details about, options and how to navigate this. But right now, LCA tools require you to study all relevant impacts, which means either you use kind of regional averages or, woodshed averages that you plug into, the LCA, the EPD. As FSC, we're not so keen on averages because then anything that one landowner might be doing that's above and beyond what others are doing gets kind of lost in the averaging exercise. We're going to be pushing on ways to maybe work through, and I picked a picture of a log yard to give you a sense of what the challenge is, there might be 100 different loggers dropping logs off, or, truckers who are dropping logs off at a yard like this one. And one, on the way in the door, they're tracking where it's coming from, but once it gets dumped into the yard, it's not typically segregated anymore. And mills will tell you it's impossible. The reality is they don't like to segregate it, but they will for the right kind of client. But generally speaking, they don't want to have to do that. So how do we get to forest level, information, whether that's biodiversity, water, carbon, indigenous people's rights, if the traceability is lost at the mill? So that's a key area to push on. Data quality and availability varies. We know soil carbon really matters, especially in more northern latitudes, but we don't really have good data on soil carbon, so we largely ignore it. But does it matter if you manage one way or another in terms of soil carbon? Absolutely. So, that's just one example. Some forest managers don't really have great inventory data, at an annual basis. Maybe they only do their inventory every 10 years. Okay, well, that's better than nothing, but it's still not necessarily going to give a lot of details. So that's one thing. We're looking, LCA requires they suggest a 20-year look back, which is fine, but 20 years forward is probably not going to be the same as 20 years back with climate change. So how well does the past predict the future? Better than nothing, but probably not perfectly. And then counterfactuals are tricky because you're basically, you probably have all seen stories attacking forest carbon projects for, faulty assumptions. And that's just basically a counterfactual. But for this work, here's what would have otherwise happened. And thus I can associate this additional carbon storage with what would have otherwise happened. But, people can always poke holes at that. So these are some of the challenges. And so what are we trying to do? One, get the research done. That's my own personal challenge. Two, the Climate Smart Wood Group we've actually got some resource now and have hired a manager and are moving forward. We're really developing procurement tools. I was just on a call right before this to try to provide the AEC sector and the sort of building industry broadly with tools folks can use to get into bid documents or other documents that project teams are using to try to find wood packages. And we think that transparency is one of the key pieces to push on. So if you go to a mill or a supplier and ask for certain kinds of information, they might look at you crosswise and be like, you're crazy. Like, we don't have any of this and we never will. But if enough people keep asking, some folks will rise to the surface and say, you know what, we can get you this, or we can help you figure out this, at least directionally, what the right approach is. So things around carbon stock change, protection of high conservation values, no deforestation. We don't want deforestation wood in our building. I mean, just saying that in the state of Oregon is a kill shot for a lot of mills. So, but my guess is you don't want to be, buying wood from, and to be clear, deforestation is largely urban growth, as cities sprawl. Satellite imagery, these days with Google Maps, we can do a lot, but if you knew the polygon of where the forest was, you could look at it from outer space. Or even just forest management plans. Can you get me the forest management plan for this forest? That just some information is better than none. And then where we're headed, and is, and David mentioned the greenhouse gas protocol. This really is going to be a big deal. And it doesn't specifically deal with buildings, but 90% of the Fortune 500, including virtually all of the big high-tech companies that are driving a lot of the mass timber marketplace, are using the greenhouse gas protocol to measure and report emissions. And today it's scope 1 and 2 emissions. Where it's going is into scope 3 emissions, including emissions tied to land use footprints. And so, maybe not tomorrow, but companies like Microsoft that are building buildings, or Google, or, Amazon, or whoever you are working for, any publicly traded company, Walmart, they're going to have to start looking at the embodied carbon and the operating emissions associated with their real estate portfolio. And to be clear, right now, the greenhouse gas protocol requires an inventory-based approach to reporting. So how much carbon was in the forest last year? How much carbon is in the forest this year? And if there's more carbon, that's a removal. And if there's less carbon, that's an emission. And that, and then that gets fed into the overall reporting that companies will be doing. So this guidance is, I was actually just told this morning on a call with someone on the working group, that it's now pushed to September. But this guidance is coming out, we'll call it later this year. It was supposed to be later this month. And it will get into a level of detail and move into pilot testing phase, which we intend to be really actively engaged around. So it's going to be a big deal, and there's going to be a lot of clients starting to think about their land use footprint, probably not for a couple years, but within a couple years, companies that report under this protocol will be required to do this kind of emissions, quantification and disclosure. And there's my email if you ever want to be in touch with me. And I'm sure we can get it through there. Okay, over to you, Jacob.